So that will take us to Thursday's latest episode of Dark Side of the Ring, The Shadow of Grizzly Smith, which I think everyone going into this, this was not a story that I knew in depth, but enough of the details are out there that you knew this was going to be a really rough watch. It was incredibly hard to stomach some of the stories in this one. I will say that, people might have different opinions of, their favorite Dark Side of the Ring, which has been like the best documentary. To me, this one was the most important documentary that they did. This really was the furthest removed from a pro wrestling documentary, and really a documentary about the survival of these children through horrific acts by Grizzly Smith. And at the end of it, to me, just shining a light on something that often it's very difficult for people to come forward with these, and stuff like this lives in secret and goes to the grave with some people of what they have struggled with in their upbringing. It was horrifying for an hour.
Yeah, it was one of the more difficult watches that I think Dark Side of the Ring has presented. For people who haven't seen it, it really goes in depth about Grizzly Smith, who is the father of Jake the Snake Roberts, Sam Houston, Rockin' Robin, and
Richard Neighbors, who is the one child who did not get involved in the wrestling industry.
And, in Jake and Robin's case, really gets into Grizzly Smith's, sexual abuse, or at least with Robin's case. And then in Jake's case, it would be his stepmother. Just horrifying stuff to hear. And, the fact that they were able to, conduct interviews with all four of them, and to be able to, hear them speak today. And, of course, Jake is such a, incredible, expressive, speaker. You really just see the effects of this sort of terrible shadow that looms among them, their lives, even to this day. It really just kind of shows the effects of, God, what terrible experiences can have on a person's life.
Yeah, I mean, for those that are, familiar with the scene in Beyond the Mat that I'm sure everyone was referencing after watching this, I mean, there is that scene with Jake and his father, and Jake explaining how he was conceived. And it's a pretty dark moment in Beyond the Mat, and this expands on it significantly. And Jake, speaking about the difference of Jake Roberts versus Aurelian Smith Jr., who stopped growing at 12 or 13. He's more comfortable now as Jake, and just how psychologically scarred he was from his upbringing, the lack of love his father showed him. Just you can see that even all these years later, just despises this man, and right down to the fact that his father would not clue him in to the secrets of his industry that would sell injuries at home. And, we kind of laugh when we hear Bret Hart talking about, being in fear of Archer the Stomper Gouldy coming to the home to kill his family. But you also look at the effect that could have on a child when you compound it with all these other issues as well. Robin Smith, to me, was what a remarkable individual that she has come out of this. I thought it was so telling, the line at the end that he ruined my childhood, but he is not going to ruin the rest of my life. And man, there is, and would have been completely understandable if she had never been able to put this past her. I found her to be remarkable in this documentary, to be able to speak about it openly, to reflect on it, and, appears to be living her life without allowing this to cast that weight on her shoulders.
Completely. I think her and Jake, seeing them at this point, to me, they're inspirations, Robin especially, and I think that was part of the reason why she wanted to be a part of this project, was to, be able to inspire people who may have gone through the same thing as her to, persevere in whatever way that they can. Jake is a really fascinating one because, yes, we did know elements of the story. I don't know if it's been ever discussed in this detail, but Jake is also somebody who we've seen glimpses of in documentary form. over the past 20 years in various stages of his life throughout his various progressions. Of course, starting from Beyond the Mat, then he had his own documentary, The Resurrection of Jake the Snake. And this, at this point, almost feels like he is now 10 years sober, and at a stage in his life where he is still clearly dealing with so many personal issues, yet seems to be at a place where he could speak with clarity about it all. But really heartbreaking to hear all the stories involved here, starting with the death of their sister or the kidnapping of their sister. And, at this point, I suppose presumed death.
Yeah, this was their half-sister, Jolynn, who was... Robin had suspected that she had been abused as well, but I guess Jolynn had never outright told her that. And she is kidnapped in 1979 when they were in Tatum, Texas. And it ended up the prime suspect was the ex-wife of Jolynn's husband, who was significantly older than Jolynn, but they could never charge her with murder because there was no body that was ever discovered. Instead, it was an aggravated kidnapping that she was convicted of, and they were able to find the former chief of police in Tatum to go over the case. And this, God, we're talking 42 years ago, and explain where their hands were tied and could not press further charges, but I guess had a 7-year prison stay. There was some really great investigating here into this specific case. And it's really heartbreaking that, there was a brutal upbringing for all of these individuals. And I was aware of the kidnapping and death of the half sister, but just to hear it and the words from Richard, who was very close with Jolynn, this is just like a childhood you cannot possibly describe. It's one brutal story after the other.
And it makes it all the more easy to understand why they would, at least in Jake's case, go on to have the amount of issues that he would go on to have. They even bring up Heroes of Wrestling here, and they show clips of it. We've reviewed that show a number of times in the past, and progressively, the first time we watched it, I think we watched it like many people did at the time. Oh my God, this is ridiculous. Haha, this is crazy. Look at this man acting, nuts. Progressively, we've reviewed this show 3 times, everybody. And progressively, up until the last time we watched it, it just becomes more and more sad and becomes less and less funny. And especially now in a context like this, knowing so much more about Jake's background, you see something like that, and it's just what the man's been throughout his entire life. You have an understanding of man, having lived through that type of childhood, having lived through, the personal experiences with his father and the rest of his family. I would you completely understand what would drive somebody to addiction. And, I thought the documentary kind of framed it all, pretty well in 40 minutes.
Yeah. The overarching shadow that this documentary exists under is Grizzly Smith, who is nothing short of a monster. Grizzly Smith, for those that it's a generation or two removed from your watching, was, a significant, primarily tag wrestler as a member of the Kentuckians that went all over the place, traveling the territories, feuding with the Assassins, and then having more of a behind-the-scenes role in Mid-South and WCW. Had a very good career, but it is none of this is a biographical trip down memory lane on the career of Grizzly Smith. It is the unspeakable horrors that he inflicted upon so many people, and God knows how many others, because the amount of stories that were just shared here, whether it be direct with Jake, who acknowledged his mother was 13 when he was born, when Grizzly Smith is with Nicola Roberts, who is the ex-wife of Sam Houston. They just randomly he picks up this 14, 15-year-old girl for this road trip with the parents sending her off with Grizzly Smith. And then Robin sharing this other story about one day Grizzly knocking on her door to come in with a 9-year-old girl. And Robin not allowing this girl to leave with Grizzly Smith. Like, Robin is just a saint in this documentary. This is just, it's horrifying stuff. And, I mean, there's just, you can't describe this Grizzly Smith figure, without just being repulsed. I mean, that's where your conclusion can only come by the end of this.
Mm-hmm. It sort of ends with like a discussion, because you hear from all four siblings, but to up until this point, like they don't indicate that they have any sort of relationship, that all four siblings are estranged from one another. And it almost ends with you leading to think that, oh, maybe they'll all like come together at the end here. But they leave that open-ended. And, I believe all four of them have pretty much said that they would like to reconnect, but they either don't know how, or because there's just been so many scars between all of them that maybe it's not even a possible thing. But I also found it interesting how, when they did discuss Grizzly Smith's death, they gave several kind of different reactions to it. You have Richard, who was in tears describing it.
And was his caretaker up until the end, because Grizzly Smith, he died in June of 2010, and was suffering from Alzheimer's at the end.
Mm-hmm. He actually says that he recognizes that despite, being given up for adoption, he recognizes that he was the lucky one among, the children, and doesn't seem to harbor, at least, or it seems to have forgiven Sam Houston. Still says he was really hurt. He says it was the worst news that he heard when he found out his father died. And you have his ex-wife.
He still looks at his father with the veil of his hero. Yeah.
Yeah. But I don't get the sense, certainly not in Robin's case, and I don't get the sense in Jake's case they feel the same way. So it would be really interesting to see what sort of follow-up. I would love to know. And then maybe this is what we get, in the Confidential series in the future on an episode like this. But I would love to know the siblings' reactions to watching this, and, if there's any follow-up conversation between the four.
Yeah. It was interesting, the line you mentioned from Richard about him being the lucky one. Did you take that as, I almost took it as I didn't have to grow up around all of this. I was lucky that I was put up for adoption and removed from this disaster.
You could be right. Yeah. That could be the proper interpretation. Yeah, it's.
Do you remember a few years ago, it was at a WrestleCon that we met Robin?
Vaguely, not so much actually.
I'm trying to remember it. It's a bit hazy, but I seem to recall we were doing some interviews, and as I remember it, she actually came up to us to talk to us just about what we were doing. Just like a pleasant woman to speak with. I can't remember if I interviewed her or not, but I do remember chatting with her for a little while, and was just a wonderful person to speak to. But that was my only interaction with Robin. I just thought she, it's just an amazing, and that's not to say that, you look at Jake, I think this really does inform the life he has lived, and that is a huge byproduct of just all of this that he has attempted to suppress. And it seems that at this stage of his life is at least, I think this was probably very therapeutic to get a lot of this out. And again, this goes to, this series, I'm sure, was very helpful for, the children, at least, of Grizzly Smith to have this.
Yeah, you would certainly hope so. Yeah, you would certainly hope so. In Jake's case, I feel like something like this informs you of maybe even his wrestling promos character, the character of Jake the Snake. He kind of talks about how, he became Jake the Snake when he was 13, 14, because he shut the door on Aurelian Smith Jr. a long time ago, and talks about kind of having to dig into this sort of darkness for his style of promo. all of that, and even just entering wrestling itself, he did it to spite his father, who told him that he would never amount to anything. So all of this kind of like completely reframes his career in many ways.
Yeah, I mean, it's that it's a whole other layer to the story that's kind of addressed, but I'm sure you could go further into it. Is that here is this person that is described as a monster and completely accurate, that has the success in this industry that 3 out of the 4 children follow him in. And yes, like Michael, you can see like looks at him in one viewpoint. With Jake, it is to prove his father wrong. Like you can see like there is this desire to find some kind of affection from his father. And then with Robin, they don't really go into like what brought her to wrestling, other than she started training and got praise, and suddenly she's in the WWF for several years.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a whole nother study about that, about like what would drive somebody to enter the family business, especially when you harbor such resentment for the patriarch of that family. But I'm sure she can talk further about it all in a future interview.
Mm-hmm. And we should also we've kind of like gone over like the issues that Robin and Jake had, but I mean also like Michael, Sam Houston. I mean, just they do spend a lot of time just on his massive drinking problems, DUIs, just endless amounts, and an attempted suicide that failed. That this guy was right at looking at his life as well, and all of the problems existed. It seemed like Richard was the only one who did not share, and who knows like whatever issues he did or did not have. But of the 3, I mean, it's remarkable that some of these people are still here, that they're still here.
Yeah. No, without a doubt. Like this whole story is, to me, kind of reminiscent of the Von Erich family story in that it's just like one beat of tragedy after another, that affects every single person. And, the fact that this documentary managed to get 4 siblings here to talk about it all, really quite remarkable in itself. So I hope they continue to just, serve as examples of perseverance through terrible upbringing.
Yeah. I mean, when you look at figures in professional wrestling's past, I mean, Grizzly Smith is right at the bottom. I mean, there's some horrible figures. I mean, he has a special place. So that was Dark Side of the Ring. A very difficult watch, but I think an important one. I think one that is certainly going to stay with people that watch this. Like it's pretty haunting, but I think also extremely important to watch. And the message at the end of people reaching out and having, the ability to not let this go unnoticed and keep it a secret, let somebody know. I thought like there was like a great service done by this documentary.
It's what you would hope, when people like take the courage to kind of volunteer their time to get into something so dark and personal to broadcast for an audience. You hope that they are doing it in service of a greater good. And I certainly hope this had that effect. So I thought a great job actually from the Dark Side of the Ring producers.
I thought a really fantastic job by that team.